Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, where we discuss the underperforming, underwhelming, underpowered, or simply unpopular lords, heroes, units, and regiments renowned of a given faction, and what could be done to help them out in the multiplayer meta, to make them a little more appealing. And of course, many of these changes, while aimed at fixing or helping multiplayer, would of course most likely improve their performance in single player as well. And in this case, we will be discussing the Force of Chaos, and this is a bit of an awkward one to approach, mostly because I expect Chaos to get a massive or substantial rework when Warhammer 3 rolls around, because it's very likely that will be a very, very Chaos-focused installment, with at least two directly Chaos-aligned factions, the Chaos Dwarves and Chaos Demons, almost a guaranteed include in there, and of course, focusing on the Darklands, which are just overrun in many cases with sort of chaotic taint and various chaos tribes. It would make sense for factions like the Beastmen or the Chaos and perhaps even Norsecote to get some overhaul there. Chaos is also probably is probably a pretty damn competitive faction when compared to especially the Beastmen nowadays, despite the fact that they're a very bare bones roster. And so I think it's a little difficult to exactly gauge if certain units need or deserve buffs, or just what sort of tweaks the Chaos roster will have, because I expect the roster to be changed up quite a bit in the upcoming months or years, I suppose. That said, there are certainly a few units and lores and such that I do think are a little undertuned, and we will be touching on those here, starting with the figurehead, the lord of the faction, the bringer of the end times, Archaeon the Everchosen, who is hiding here behind a tree because he doesn't want his face seen. Now, Archaeon has gone through quite a bit of change, and all of that change essentially has been for the better. Of course, he looks amazing with Dorgar here, just demon steed, just looks insane. But of course, Archaeon used to not have AP damage. That's been improved. Some of his items have gotten some improvements. Slayer of Kings is a pretty insane buff nowadays. Crown of Domination is a very useful for Chaos because it gives you immunity psychology, which is almost non-existent in the faction. Surprisingly, you'd expect like the hordes of hell to not be too concerned about fear and terror, but they are. So Crown of Domination, definitely pretty powerful. He himself is an insane duelist. Crazy good stats. He's got magic damage, which is often good for helping snipe down lords, especially if they cast like physical resistance effects. Very high armor, a bronze shield. He does have 470 weapon strength, and it's AP. Surprisingly, no fire damage, but this, I guess, is just the standard nowadays for like every unit that has a fiery sword. Sunfang, no fire damage. The Bright Wizard hasn't had fire damage for years, and I don't know if we'll ever see that, unfortunately. But Archaeon, definitely quite the beast. The big problem, in my opinion, is that Archaeon is ultimately designed to be a sort of aggressive lord. He kind of suffers in a similar manner to Tyrion, and I don't think it's quite as bad, because in his case he does have better utility. You do have the Crown of Domination. You do have Lore of Fire, which is a very solid Lore of Magic. And you do have a lot more baseline HP, so you're not worried about like routing prematurely before your Heart of Avalorn really comes into effect or anything like that. So I think Archaeon is a little bit better than Tyrion from a... and of course he does suffer from competing against Thorel and Kolek, who are insanely good. But I do think he is a little overpriced for what he provides, especially because it's difficult to really get him on the targets you want him fighting against. To get good value out of Archaeon, he needs to be fighting some elites, much like Tyrion. He needs to be clobbering like big monsters like dragons and elite monsters, infantry, like perhaps Fimir or something, or he needs to be beating the snot out of enemy heroes and lords. And to get him into that position with Dorgar is a bit difficult. And I think the simple solution here would be to cut down his cost a little bit, so it's not as punishing if you brought Archaeon. It's not as much of a risk. Otherwise, I actually think Archaeon's in a pretty good spot. I don't want him to be like overtuned to the point that he's just an insta-pick over, say, Kolek or Thorel, because those are already very strong lords. I think it's always going to be a difficult position, especially for someone like Archaeon, to really outcompete those lords. But I would like to see him get a little bit more viability, just enable... just make him a little more viable, and I don't think he needs much. I think that he's already a fairly viable lord. I just think a slight decrease in cost really would do him justice. Because right now with full kit he's like 3,300. Now obviously you're gonna strip some magic away, but you are paying 2,800 for a lord on a horse. The only one who's comparable, I think, is in this is Cetra. The problem is, who's also very expensive when you put him on a horse still, but Citra, in my opinion, has a little more utility. The spells in lore of Nehakar are generally a little more support-oriented than Archaeon's more aggressive spells. The Tomb King playstyle is generally much more defensive, where you definitely have much more defensive playstyle options as the Tomb Kings than you do as Chaos, where you're sort of forced to go aggressive, and because of that, Archaeon needs to be able to sort of actively seek out his targets, which Citra, and Citra also does have an explosion effect that can knock enemies away from him and help him clear the path for himself. So I think Citra who's probably the closest comparison to Archaeon, in just being a very combat proficient caster lord on a horse. And you see Citra pretty often on a horse. I think that just some slight tweaks there make Archaeon either a tiny bit cheaper or give him some sort of explosion knockback effect like what Citra has, to let him plow through enemies. Call him like the Wrath of Uzul. I forget what the name of the demon bound his blade is. I think it's Uzul or something. Or call it like the Wrath of his demon blade or something, and yeah, have him explode and knock enemies back and let him escape sort of in surrounds at least a few times. That could also be a good fix there for the Lord of the End Times. Now, besides that, there is Prince Sigvald the Magnificent, and while an amazing and, of course, the most gorgeous Chaos Lord, and of course, actually an amazing Chaos Lord, campaign Lord, in my opinion, the best, or at least competing with Kolek for being the best, just because he does start with the Hell Cannon as extra holder growth. But in Quick Match, he's kind of fallen off. He used to be a meta pick back in Warhammer 1, because he was your go-to budget Lord for survivability. This has fallen off a good bit in Warhammer 2. Various changes to factions. The survivability thing on him has just not been as valuable. I guess Kolek and the Everchicken who were always competitive before, have sort of remained competitive. But Sigvald has kind of fallen off as a Foot Lord. I think Chaos's potential to go with super wide builds has also fallen off a little bit due to some changes made to their roster. Certain units have become a little less competitive, I think. Especially Chaos Marauders used to be a bit more competitive back in the days of Warhammer 1. Units like that, so going super wide is a little less viable. And Sigvald's fallen off. Now, Sigvald, on paper, his stats are pretty insane. The problem is he's footbound. He does have Deadly Onslaught and Foe Seeker. He does have Standard Die, so it's some utility there. Auric Armor gives him regen, which isn't bad. The problem is nowadays, and the other thing I should mention is that before, Chaos was much more susceptible to Lord Sniping. I do believe Chosen actually got some rounds of, say, leadership buffs, for example, which before they had lower leadership, if I remember correctly. So they'd often route much easier than they do now. And so that was a big plus for Sigvald, having a Lord that was borderline unsnipeable. Nowadays, though, yeah, Sigvald just doesn't bring that much to the table. He regens. That's essentially his only gimmick, but ultimately his HP pool is not... He's got 4,000 HP, which, yes, he can heal up to about 7,000 total, but it does take time, and in that time he's being essentially useless, because he can do very little. He doesn't have AP on his blade. He does have Strider and Expert Charge Defense, which is kind of nice, but realistically making use of that in a battle is difficult. Immune Psychology is nifty. Basically, he's unbreakable with his high leadership, but yeah, Siggy's definitely not a popular choice nowadays. And I have used him a little bit. I do think he's viable, or he can be made to work, but I think that there could be some changes made to him to make him a little more appealing. First and foremost, some sort of aura, and I was thinking some things to go with his insane vanity. Something like Attend Me. Give him an ability that lets him boost leadership in an area, and perhaps boost like melee attack or something, but in exchange, drop nearby units melee defense. Friendly units melee defense. Otherwise, give him debuff auras similar to Marathi. Like, she's got an enchanting beauty. You could give him something like that. It would go very well with his narcissistic theme. You could even make it like an enchanting beauty that has like a friendly fire to it to some extent, where like it debuffs nearby allied units a little bit and debuffs enemy units more. So you kind of have to decide how you want to balance it. But I could see some fun little things going in there with Sigvald. The other proposal I've seen to fix him or improve him has been to give him AP damage. Personally, I'm not a fan of this. The reason being that while Sigvald definitely has more right to have AP than a lot of lords that got AP in Warhammer 2, I hate that approach to balancing. This just get everything AP and call it a day. The fact that 10-1 with his Prison Shank got AP is, in my opinion, beyond ludicrous. And it just, in my opinion, kills the flavor a bit. I would obviously it could be a viable help to Sigvald. Then again, as a foot lord, his ability to utilize that AP is definitely a bit limited. So perhaps that would be some buff. You could give him like just inverse or flip his AP to non-AP values here, or just give him like probably reduce the exact overall weapon strength. Maybe drop it to like 480 or something. Give him 300 AP, 180 normal, something like that. That could help. That said, I do think he needs some sort of area of effects. Enchanting Beauty could be one. Give it something like a 10 me where his units. Perhaps make it something where like his units nearby are rampage, or imbues all nearby units with rampage, but improves their leadership by 12. Something like that. Something silly and a bit flavorful and fun. Could be helpful. Maybe like maybe could grant like immunity to psychology and a leadership buff in an area while imbuing rampage. There's plenty of, in my opinion, sort of innovative ways you could approach this, and I personally prefer those to just generic give him a horse or give him some sort of mount fixes. Next up, and the final lord who I do think is a little bit troubled, is the vanilla Chaos Lord. The reason being is that, so if you're going to bring this guy, he's pretty expensive. He is only 100 gold cheaper than Sigvald, while having significantly inferior stats on foot. I don't know if I have him here. Here we go. Chaos Lord on foot compared to Sigvald. Look at the stat difference there. 400 less HP. He's got 10 less armor. He's got 50 less leadership. No immunity to psychology and no strider baseline. Less mobility. 7 less speed. 5 less melee attack, 5 less melee defense, 30 less weapon strength, 10 less charge. He's just worse across the board. And he costs 100 less, and that's your only benefit. So, realistically, if you're going to bring this guy on foot, you're not going to bring this guy as a budget lord option on foot. He doesn't provide the support effects to make him a really useful option on a mid-tier mount. So the only real reason you'd bring this guy is to bring him on a dragon, and the problem is that if you're going to bring him on a dragon, you're much better off bringing a Chaos Sorcerer on a dragon, who has almost the same stats, and can bring magic to the field, which makes him much more cost-effective. What does the Chaos Lord have going for him? Well, quite frankly, not much. He does have okay melee stats, though certainly not stellar. Chaos is not the greatest faction when it comes to dominating the air. They've only got, well, the Feral Manticore, which is an abysmal unit, and then they can get 2 heroes on Manticores and a Lord on a Dragon. So their ability to contest the air against most factions is very limited, and that makes the Dragon picks a very niche choice to begin with. Then on top of that, the Chaos Lord doesn't really bring much utility. He has some good self buffs. He's got Pendant of Slanesh, which is a crazy self buff to melee attack and speed. He does have Filth Mace, which imbues him with poison, as well as Terror, which is useless on a dragon, and gives him more non-AP weapon damage, which is also useless when on a dragon. So essentially it's just a poison item. When you're on a dragon, at least. His area of effects nearly non-existent. He gets standard die. He has Deadly Onslaught and Foe Seeker, both limited to just him. And I think you can see why in that situation this guy's very unpopular. If you're going to bring a dragon, you bring a caster, all in one with the caster. If you're going to bring a combat-oriented lord, you're probably going to bring Kolek, who's safer because you can keep him on the ground, and you can crump enemies with that anti-large bonus. If you're going to bring a lord on a horse, well, either you're going to go budget and bring a caster on a horse, or you're going to bring Archaeon with some sort of stripped down variation, but you're not going to bring a Chaos Lord on a horse because he's not going to get almost any benefit out of most of his combat items here. He doesn't have AP damage even, so he's very limited there. Now the big fix, in my opinion, for the Chaos Lord would be to give him mutually exclusive Marks of Chaos, and this is something that honestly should be extended and will probably be extended in the upcoming updates, I would assume, especially when Warhammer 3 rolls around. But having the ability right now, you can like overlap the Pendant of Slanesh and the Filth Mace here, which that's kind of like a Nurgle thing, and then you got a Slanesh thing, which is weird. If you could customize your lord so he gets significant benefits based on whatever lord he's pledged allegiance to, that could be pretty awesome. If you could, for example, get a temporary stock with Tzeentch, regen with Nurgle, which could be huge on a dragon. Having a regeneration dragon could be pretty nuts. It's like a Terrorgeist Lord or Vampire Lord at that point. And still, because you're Chaos and you've got these limited air options, I don't think it would be too oppressive, really. And other options for Khorne could grant like a Frenzy and Slanesh. I don't know, more leadership, melee attack, something along those lines. You could definitely sort out buffs or more speed and melee attack, something along those lines. But you could definitely sort out buffs and debuffs here and there, based on mount, but or But I think that would be the most direct fix. Another thing you could give him is the Blasted Standard, which the Chaos Sorcerer currently has. It means the Chaos Sorcerer essentially has more utility than the Chaos Lord. It grants plus 12% block chance. Very nice with your Silver Shielded Infantry, makes them near invulnerable to missile play. Especially Chosen go up to like 72% missile block, which is nuts. Otherwise, you could also make it where those Marks of Chaos would improve nearby troops as well, give them some sort of aura effects. Like Nurgle would grant increased physical resist or something, make the units more resistant to pain. Or let you have a one-time cast of the Can't Die ability, like the Skinks have. Abilities like that. And obviously this would extend to like other, perhaps marked, if we started having marks, something like that could take effect, I think. But it's simply the way I think the Chaos Lord needs to be buffed. Because utility is one way to do it. Definitely giving him some more auras. The Blasted Standard could be one of them. Giving him something that grants more melee attack in an area. Something in the style of Helm of Discord, perhaps. Or Horn of the First Beast, that sort of thing. But otherwise, I do think Marks of Chaos would be the most flavorful and more friendly way to go. And I could see ways both to make it an area of effect, as well as, if one desired, a single target effect. And make him just an excellent duelist. Which does bring us on to heroes, and Chaos doesn't have many heroes to criticize because they've only got 2 of them. One of them is the Exalted Hero, the other one the Generic Sorcerer, and honestly, I think the Generic Sorcerer is pretty good. He's a bit expensive because he's pretty tanky and has good combat stats for caster, but honestly, he's not bad. The Exalted Hero, though, definitely struggles a little bit, and part of the problem is that he doesn't. So there's no way to give him AP. So his weapon strength is never. He's never that devastating, in my opinion. You look at his stats here, and he's got a roughly. He's got a little over. He's got like 33% of his damage is AP. So definitely on the low, sort of not the greatest AP percentage there, and he's meant to be a killer hero. He doesn't really bring utility to the field. He's not an Empire Warrior Priest who's there to buff up his troops. He's essentially meant to be something from what, like, looking at his equipment, looking at his Hellfire Sword and his Mark of Khorne, which gives him Frenzy, looking at Foeseeker to the Onslaught, he's essentially meant to be something like a High Elf Noble. He's meant to be a killer or a Tomb Prince or unit like that, but without AP and being limited to mounts that don't grant him AP, even the Manticore only has non-AP damage. And of course, it doesn't synergize. Chaos doesn't have the great flying options, so it doesn't really synergize well with Chaos. And being sort of limited by that, essentially to a horse mount or foot. Obviously, you're never going to really get to foot, so you're essentially limited to horse mount. I think that doesn't limit his utility. I think a simple price cut could help him a little bit. Otherwise, once again, expanding those Marks of Chaos so that you could have more than just the Mark of Khorne, so that there would be options for like a Mark of Slaanesh. Mark of Nurgle and that sort of thing could help him, give him a little more customization options, so you could be a little more varied that way. So cost cut definitely could be one way of doing it. The other one, giving him more sort of varied buffs, so you could bring a little more personal utility. You could cater him more to a specific matchup. Part of the problem is that usually if you've got these fighty heroes, they tend to perform better on more defensive functions. That's, for example, why the Tomb Prince, as well as the High Elf Noble, in my opinion, tend to perform pretty damn well. Because you bring him on a horse and then use them as a back catcher to defend your backline and deny enemy units trying to bust through. And that's why a Noble and Tomb Prince can often find a home. They can often find a position where they can have a significant impact because their factions are much more defensive in nature. The problem is that with Chaos, because you are an aggressive faction, your only defensive option is Hell Cannon, and that's not really a defensive option because of how it can't fight enemy artillery. So you have to be aggressive, and trying to aggressively seek out enemy lords and heroes when you're limited to a ground mount is very difficult. And if you put yourself up on a Manticore, you're suddenly risking a lot against factions that can bring a serious air force, or have serious anti-air capabilities. So I think a cut to the Exalted Hero's cost, just like 50 down, would probably be decent. And then maybe cutting the cost of some of his mounts would be a little helpful. Like, for example, the Manticore could definitely, in my opinion, go down in cost. Otherwise, giving more HP to the Manticore would also be nice. Because right now it only has 4,000. Give it like 4,500. Make it a little tankier. That would definitely be nice. It is, after all, a roster with no healing. So it could be helpful. If we don't see marks, especially if we don't see like regen from Nurgle, I could see that being useful. So that you would have a little more potential to use them in an aggressive, divey manner. I personally am not fond of the idea of giving him, say, Guardian. I feel like that one's a bit overdone. It's handed out like candy nowadays, and that could lead to some nasty synergy with Kolek, for example. But I definitely would like to see him do a little more. Otherwise, buff his weapon strength more. Not necessarily make it AP majority, but give him more weapon strength. Like right now, if these start the battle here, his Mark of Khorne will kick in. So now he's up to 453, and he's got 73 melee attack. You could push that a little further. Make him a very aggressive option. Or give him some sort of Inspire on hit. When he hits an enemy unit, or when he's engaged in melee, he provides nearby troops with an aura that gives like +5 melee attack or something. I just think there's a lot of options you could do. Something to promote that, to make him synergize with an aggressive playstyle, which is ultimately what Chaos is all about. And I'd just like to see that given to the Exalted Hero. That's really something to keep in mind, I think, is just how a faction is designed. That oftentimes horse heroes for factions like Empire, well, an Archlector or Karl Franz, you throw him in with a pocket of demis, and yes, you've got a great Doom Blob. Or a faction like High Elves and the Tomb Kings, because of how they can do like a sister of Avalorn, Bolt Thrower box, or they can bring like masses of archers or Loth and Seaguard, or you might see Ushapti Great Bows and Bone Giants. In those defensive situations, a mobile hero with AP anti-large is suddenly, or even just good combat stats, is suddenly a very appealing choice. But when you're not, when you don't have that synergy really, and when you're forced to go aggressive, you can't force the enemy to come to you, your utility drops quite a bit, in my opinion. Which is why I think the cost needs to go down. Now that does take us out of our lords and heroes and does get us on to our infantry, and there's not much to be said for these guys. First and foremost, Chaos Marauders with great weapons. These guys, simply put, in my opinion, are overpriced. I believe I already touched on this in the Norska video. I think a good 25 gold down would be the way to go, would make them a little more competitive. Maybe even 50 gold reduction. But the fact of the matter is that if against the vast majority of targets, so against basically any squishy target, these guys get outperformed by normal Chaos Marauders. And even against tanky, heavily armored targets, they barely outperform Chaos Marauders. Get minced through in seconds, and they still don't really pay for themselves. Like, taking 30% of the HP off of a unit of elite great weapons is probably not paying for the... Like, these guys attack a unit like, say, Greatswords, and the Greatswords will mince through them pretty damn quickly. These guys will take, like, I believe it's like 30 or 40% of their HP off. That's not paying for themselves. So what does this unit do well? Well, it doesn't really do anything well, in my opinion. Like, it doesn't shine in any specific situation. They are pretty mobile, which is nice, for sure. They do have relatively good melee attack, unlike, say, Dwarf Grey weapons, who have abysmal melee attack. Some weapon strength at 27, though I think their weapon strength is another thing I could use to tweak. I could say, like, minus 25 cost, and plus 3 weapon strength, like 1 non-AP, 2 AP, would be nice as well. But regardless, my point being, the Chaos Marauders with weapons definitely very overpriced. There's a reason you basically never see them in competitive play, whether or even in quick match or anything like that. These guys are a very rare pick, and it's because they just don't shine anywhere. You want to, even if you want to compromise dwarf lines, you can get go wider. For every 2 of these guys, essentially, you can, well, what would the ratio be? For every 3, you get 3 of these guys, you get 4 Marauders, and the Marauders will still, they won't trade. These guys won't really trade much better into Dwarf Warriors. I do believe they still lose to Dwarf Warriors. They will not really beat down, like normal Marauders will beat Miners, and having an extra unit on the field is often valuable. So that's kind of a problem with these guys. They're just very flimsy and kind of expensive for what they do. 500 gold is not cheap for a unit that has no armor, no melee defense, and not the greatest offense stats, especially the weapon strength. Alongside them, Aspiring Champions. Now, this is a unit that's honestly not terrible. They give you an Encourage aura in an area of effect around them, and have pretty monstrous weapon stats, or melee stats, so they can stay in a fight and provide support. The problem is they have some really weird options here. Like, for example, they've got the Vanguard deployment. Personally, I would like to see these guys buffed into essentially a non-monstrous or non-large monstrous infantry. I think that would be pretty awesome. See them get like a little more HP, not a huge amount, because you want to keep in mind that you don't want this unit to become overtuned in situations where you're fighting enemy anti-large. Like, for example, you're plowing into a pike line. Normally, with monsters infantry, you can pull it off on stacked on top of infantry, but at least there is some penalty. With these guys, if they suddenly had like monsters infantry HP pools and were small, that would be insane. That would just be an obscene unit to deal with. But I think perhaps tweaking their cost upward, making them like a 700, 800 gold unit, increasing HP to say the 3000s, and giving them a significant boost to their weapon strength, bump it up to like 80 and make it AP, would make this unit a really fun, flavorful, and unique choice. Something that's unique to Chaos. A pushy sort of monstrous infantry that's not actually monstrous infantry. And take away Vanguard, of course, because they'd lose that. And they could keep Encourage and all that, definitely. But it would, in my opinion, just make them spice things up a little bit, make them a fun sort of support tool you throw on top of Chaos Marauders. I think that would definitely make them more useful. Right now, you'll occasionally bring like one to improve your leadership situation, but that's about it. And you don't really bring them for the unit. The unit itself is essentially pointless. It's just there to be a buff bot, which is a bit boring for a unit that's called Aspiring Champions. Next up, we do have Forsaken, and this is a unit that I'm sure some people are not surprised by being on this list. Forsaken used to be an amazing choice back in Warhammer 1, where combat tended to be shorter, more blitzier, HP pools were lower. Forsaken could just ram into a front line and crush it in seconds, and it made them very, very powerful. Nowadays, though, they've definitely fallen off. The fact that they have no shields, their armor is not the greatest by Chaos standards. They are pretty pricey at 750. They actually cost the same as Chaos Warriors, which is definitely unfortunate. And the fact that, of course, their enemies are now much tankier limits these guys' utility. Yeah, they've got Frenzy, which grants immune psychology, boosts all their stats, or their melee attack, weapon strength, and charge bonus. They do hit very hard, but they are a very squishy unit. And tend to buckle pretty quickly if you don't get an ideal situation. Oftentimes as Chaos, you're going to get essentially the same results with a unit like Chaos Warriors, except they're much more stable and reliable. You're not going to see them crash and burn if you happen to get a bad or subpar engagement. Whereas Forsaken, if they don't get an ideal engagement, if they get prematurely engaged by Cavalry or something, they will start falling apart very badly. Chaos Warriors, not so much. They'll hold okay. They can soak up a bit of missile pressure. They can soak up a cavalry charge if needed. They've got that extra 1200 HP, which is really nice. Personally, I'd like to see Forsaken get the War Dancer treatment. War Dancers back in Warhammer 1 only had 60 models as well. They were a very flimsy, limited unit that only had 60 models, and that made them kind of unreliable. Giving Forsaken 75 models, in my opinion, even if not with a corroborating HP buff, like buff their HP up to like 6,000. Nothing crazy, but buff them up to like 6,000. Give them an extra 50 models. Maybe drop their weapon strength a tiny bit. Like, that would be a 25% buff. So drop it by like, probably not a full 20% because 25% because I don't think that the unit is that strong right now. But perhaps drop it by like 15%. And I think the unit would be in a better spot. It would be a little tankier. It would still be able to blitz enemies. At the same time, it wouldn't be such a gamble and unreliable unit. Because right now, these guys will do great in specific situations that are incredibly difficult to guarantee or even try to guarantee, and that, in my opinion, makes Forsaken much less reliable than Chaos Warriors. Otherwise, you could drop their price. These guys, in my opinion, are probably about worth 700 right now, maybe like 675. Personally, I would like to just see that upward tweak in HP. They are, after all, a bunch of deformed, crazy Chaos Loons, so I don't see why they shouldn't have a bit more HP, be a little bit tankier or a little more resilient. Even a straight buff to HP pool would probably help this unit quite a bit, even if they didn't get more models. Though I feel like the more model thing could Well, there could be some give or take there with the balance. But definitely make them a little bit tankier or make them a bit cheaper. It'll be my way to go. Next up, Chaos Chosen with great weapons. My simple take here is minus 50 gold. I think the unit's not terrible. It is actually one of, if not the only great weapon that takes on Black Orcs and while wad up and still wins. If the Orcs are wad up, these guys can tank the wall and then beat the crap out of the Black Orcs afterwards. Like, they'll just stick around and beat them. Yeah, they're pretty nuts. Their stats are amazing. The problem is they are 1450 gold, and in most cases you're just not going to bring this unit, because ultimately Chosen with Sword and Board, especially if backed up by a Plague of Rust, are much tankier and about as and more. They'll do about as well versus enemy great weapons and enemy halberds and shielded units with Plague of Rust support especially. Yeah, honestly, Chosen Sword and Board are not bad at all, and Chosen Sword and Board are just so strong. Chosen great weapons are niche to the point that you basically never see them. You will almost never even see one of these units take the field, much less multiples. And while I can understand that as an elite infantry, fact of the matter is you see Chosen with shields pretty often, and you see Chosen with halberds a decent amount of the time, because they just perform that anchor task much more effectively. And Chosen with great weapons, ultimately, let's be honest, while people often gripe about AP being super common or great weapons being super common, you don't see those units that often. To justify bringing the Chosen. And against factions where they should shine, like Dwarves, where almost everything has armor, these guys are just very slow, very easy to focus with guns and artillery and that sort of stuff, and runes. And it ends up making them less appealing. And so I could see Chosen with great weapons simply getting a like 50 gold price drop. Make them on par with halberds for cost. And I think that would help them a good bit. Just make them a tiny bit more appealing. Next up, we are moving on to... Well, we're almost done now. We're moving on to Cavalry. Swords of Chaos are the only Cavalry I think needs tweaking here. They're kind of overpriced, and their niche of crushing infantry is something Chaos has no problem with to begin with. Yeah, Chaos destroys infantry easily. Their entire infantry roster is literally the most powerful infantry roster in the game. Like I just said, Chosen with great weapons can beat down Black Orcs even if Black Orcs get the Wa off. Normal Chosen will beat Black Orcs without a Wa. I'm not actually sure how they trade with them if they get the wall, but it's still going to be a pretty tight fight. Cheaper Chaos Infantry is very cost-effective. Chaos Warriors Great Weapons, of course, have been a sort of standard of excellence for Great Weapon mid-tier infantry, and still are. They're stupidly good. And so Swords of Chaos are doing... And honestly, even normal Chaos Knights are very good at running over infantry. So what do Swords of Chaos bring? Well, they've got more... They've got AP, which is nice. And they've got a little more staying power than in some ways, because they've got better stats than Chaos Knights. The problem is they actually have less HP than Chaos Knights, which is kind of silly. I think they should get that buffed for sure. They've got Guardian, which can synergize with, say, Kolek. Ironically, you won't often see Archaeon coming in with these guys, even though they're Archaeon's bodyguard, but Guardian can be okay. The biggest problem is this Apocalyptic Charge here, which is honestly kind of trash. It gives them plus 24% speed and charge speed. Your opponent can easily bait this out just by running a unit close to your Chaos formation. Not exactly the most difficult thing to do. It's 70-meter range. I feel like at very least, this unit, if this ability isn't going to be made activatable, at very least it should be affecting charge bonus. Chaos units do tend to have solid charge bonus. Chosen at 32, of course, Forsaken are insane at 39. Aspiring Champs 26, Chaos Marauders here 21. So we actually have like the breadth of the Chaos roster essentially, and you can see how their charge bonuses are not bad. So getting a say plus 24% charge bonus, it's plus 8 on the Chosen. That would still be like plus 5 on the Marauders. It's a buff, and it would be a much more niftier and useful buff than just a simple speed improvement. The other point I would say is make them a little cheaper. They are kind of... You pay 1,700 for these guys. They can't really fight enemy cav that well. Like, Demigriffs, I'm pretty sure with halberds still beat these guys down. Obviously, you never bring them against High Elves because they've got fire damage, so Dragon Princes will beat them down. I'm pretty sure Horned Ones beat these guys, so I could be wrong there. Demigriffs might. Of course, Dedicated Anti-Large, I'm pretty sure both Blood and Grail Knights beat these guys. So, like, you're very rarely going to bring these guys into situations where they'd fight Cavalry, and being a Cavalry themselves, they're going to have a tough time getting engagements against big monsters, because generally you'll have your opponent zoning them with infantry. And for killing infantry, these guys are just overkill or too expensive in a roster that's already good at that. So yeah, my recommendation, overhaul Apocalyptic Charge. Give them the same HP as normal Chaos Knights. Perhaps shake up the exact unit composition here. Give them 24 models instead of 18. Let's be honest, these stats are not that insane. If this was a 24 model unit, Demigryph Knights with Halberds have, 56, I believe, weapon strength? Off the top of my head. Baseline. And there's 24 models in the unit. This is another unit where I feel like the Forsaken, I feel like got overlooked when Warhammer 1 factions were brought into Warhammer 2, just like with War Dancers, we got buffed up to 75 models. And then I feel like when Demigryphs got buffed up to 24 models, the Swords of Chaos got untouched. And they're just not good enough unit to justify having 18 models, I think. Otherwise, buff their stats a bunch, like make them hit harder. 18 models, these guys should easily have 60 plus weapon strength. And like another 5 melee attack and defense. They could be real elites there. But that's just my 2 cents. Finally, we do have and I don't think that's not terribly. A lot of it just comes down to the roster. The last few things here, we do have Hounds. The only take I have on these guys is either give them Vanguard, like the Beastmen Warhounds, or make them 25 gold cheaper. That's really my only critique there. The fact that they don't have Vanguard and they cost the same as the Beastmen Warhounds is a little silly, in my opinion. And finally, Hell Cannons. Now, this is a unit that I simply think is overpriced. Especially normal Hell Cannon only has 25 ammo. So even if you protect, and the homing is not that reliable. So even if you protect this unit a lot of the time, you won't get reliable results out of them. And you're on a roster that has no real counter battery options. And this is, except for, I guess, Fireball spam, but that's kind of niche and a bit RNG reliant. But, and relying on the fact that Fireball doesn't get nerfed, which it might. But, yeah, the problem is that, so the Hell Cannon, very easy to counter battery. Not the greatest, even if it gets its full value out. And keep in mind, you compare it to, say, like and you might be thinking, well, there's other factions that don't have good counter battery options, like Beastmen with the Cygor. The problem is that a Cygor, yes, it's not likely to counter battery enemy artillery well, but a Cygor at least has a high HP pool, so it's able to tank cannon shots for days. It can absorb a lot of punishment. A Hell Cannon, I think, takes like, we can actually I can't force the AI to do out, but it's got like 1200 or so HP. It takes a few cannonballs to the face, is dead. It takes a few fireballs to the face, it's a goner. You lost your 1200 gold artillery piece now. It's gone, it's dead, it's getting you no more value. And I don't know what else to say. I think the unit should definitely be at least 100 cheaper, just so it's a little more viable on a very expensive roster like Chaos. Especially because the faction just has so little synergy with the Hell Cannon. It's just so easy to disrupt backlines. And against Chaos, because they're usually pretty narrow. If you go with a defensive build as Chaos, and you're... I'm trying to think of where you'd really bring the Hell Cannon. I've seen people try to use it against, or abuse it against, like, Norska. Or factions that can't fight back. But I do feel like dropping about 100 gold off it would make it a little more viable. Make it a tiny bit more appealing. Soul Damnation could also use a tiny price cut, in my opinion, though it is in a much better spot. I do think its Soul Devourer trait is a little too easy to bait. You get like any unit within range of the Soul Damnation. You can literally have a Flying Lord to hover around within 200 yards of it. And the Soul of Damnation now has used up its ability. And if your army's camping outside its range, which is entirely doable, boom, you just made your opponent waste or lose like one of the big selling points of the Soul of Damnation. Either way, that is my take on Chaos. I don't think Chaos is in a terrible spot. Most of the units honestly pretty solid, and like I said, I'm expecting Marks of Chaos to make an appearance come Warhammer 3. And that could shake things up a lot for especially the more elite units here, as well as, of course, the Chaos Lord and the Exalted Hero and that sort of stuff. But until then, there are definitely a few tweaks that I felt were worth mentioning. As usual, if you guys have your own comments, criticism, questions, don't hesitate to put them down below. I will do my very best to respond as soon as I can. I always appreciate seeing the insight you guys have, and sometimes you guys disagree, sometimes you agree. Always good to know. Sometimes it's nice to see get inspiration for sort of new builds or ideas that I hadn't thought of before and might make some of these units viable. But if you think there's units I missed, of course, or if you think I've put some of these units on here incorrectly, be sure to let me know. I'd honestly love to hear it. And I suppose that is it. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.